It's my pleasure to welcome you on our JTS Colloque Zoom Learning, Longing for the Land, Understanding the Dream and Challenges of the State of Israel. I'm Carolyn Cantor, one of the directors of Principal Gifts for JTS. We're really delighted to have Rabbi Matt Berkowitz, JTS Director of Israel Programs, teach this morning. Many of you know him. Rabbi Berkowitz is based at the Shokin Institute in Jerusalem. In this capacity, he's responsible for the academic and experiential contours of the Israel program for both our rabbinical and cantorial students. You can find the source materials this morning in the chat, but we'll also be sharing them during the presentation. I think you're all Zoom pros by now. You are muted, as you can tell, but we ask that you raise your hand when there are questions or comments. We have the class scheduled for an hour this morning, but Rabbi is happy to stay on live for 15 minutes or so afterwards for follow-up questions. Good morning, and Rabbi Berkowitz.
Thank you so much, Carolyn. I want to say Boker Tov, good morning to all of you in North America, and Tzoraim Tovim, good afternoon from Israel. Although I feel like it's not me that's sitting in Israel, I'm looking out at Alan Newman right now, and it looks like you're the one that's really sitting in Israel, Alan. So usually I rail against these backgrounds, but Alan, I thank you for being in the spirit of things. And it's great to see you with that, that wonderful background of a typical Israeli landscape. So I welcome all of you who are joining this morning from North America. And for those of you who were on previous sessions in which I was teaching from JTS in Jerusalem, and for all of our newcomers, I want to welcome you to JTS's campus in Jerusalem. I am teaching from the Shokin Library, the Shokin Institute, located on Balfour Street, just across from the Prime Minister's residence here in Jerusalem. And it's always a great privilege to be learning with you. Thank you for being in this Beit Midrash. So today we're going to be taking a look at Israel and the Holocaust, and very, very specifically, the Kastner trial, which is what I call the other Holocaust trial. Obviously, when I say that, I'm referring to the Kastner trial in reference to the Eichmann trial, right? The most famous Holocaust trial in Israel. And that trial in particular was responsible for changing the Israeli psyche with regard to Holocaust memory in this country. Today, I want to delve into this little known Holocaust trial that took place in the 1950s. It is an absolutely fascinating footnote of Israeli history. I'm sure if you don't know about it already, it's going to inspire you to learn more. And I want to begin with a general background, first of all, talking about the place of the Holocaust in Israeli identity, in Israeli memory. From that general background, we're going to turn to the figure of Rudolf Kastner, otherwise known as Yisrael Kastner, Israel Kastner, and we'll delve into his story. We'll follow the many twists and turns of his story and trial, and bring it all the way up to modern day as well. We'll have a very, very interesting curveball towards the end of our hour together. So let me first begin with the place of the Holocaust in Israeli society. You know well that the Holocaust figures prominently in Israeli Jewish identity and consciousness. And though today, Israel and Israelis have a healthier psychological relationship to Holocaust memory, this was not always the case, and certainly it wasn't the case in the early years of the state. For the state builders and the Zionists of the 1950s, the Holocaust represented the vindication of the Zionist movement. What I mean by that is that the Holocaust became symbolic of the closing of the gates, essentially the ne'ilah of Jewish life in Europe. It was a reminder of Jews going to their deaths like sheep to the slaughter. And that image of Jews being weak and defenseless flies in the face of the whole Zionist enterprise. Modern Zionism, we know well, was all about the creation of the new Jew. And what I mean by that is the Jew that's strong, the Jew that's enterprising, vigilant, and self-reliant. Right? And the obvious turning point in Israeli psyche and thinking with regard to the Shoah, with regard to the Holocaust, came in 1961 with the trial of Adolf Eichmann. Survivors were given permission to, quote unquote, come out of the closet. It was no longer a badge of shame. And with Eichmann, with the Eichmann trial, the focus was on the perpetrator. It was on the architect of the final solution, Adolf Eichmann. With the trial that we're going to be talking about this morning with Rudolf Kastner, the focus was on the victims. The focus was on us as Jews, as Israelis. But most importantly, what I want you to understand is once upon a time in Israeli society, it was a great shame to be a survivor of the Holocaust, right? You were viewed, you as survivors, were viewed as the remnants of the sheep that went to the slaughter, right? It was a sign of weakness. It's very, very telling that Holocaust Memorial today in Israel is not only called Yom HaShoah, but it's Yom HaShoah v'Hagvura. It's the day of Holocaust memory and of heroism, of remembering heroes in the Holocaust. And I'm sure many of you are familiar with the torch lighting ceremony that takes place on Holocaust Remembrance Day at Yad Vashem, right? Yad Vashem and Israeli society, right, writ large, what do they do for that ceremony? They choose those who fought, right? Those who were actively fighting against the Nazis, those who were the portrayal of not only heroism, but also of the Zionist spirit, right? So it's a very, very strong reminder of who we are and who we want to be as Israelis, to say that we are strong, to say that we are self-reliant, right? And to say that we did not go passively to our deaths, right? So it becomes even more than a symbol. I want you to understand that in context, it's a very, very important piece of the background to the unfolding of the story of Rudolf Kastner. So I want to turn to the first page of the study packet that you received as a PDF. We're going to follow these sources through. We'll start with number one, which gives us some background on Rudolf Kastner. So the first question, who was Rudolf Kastner? Kastner was born in 1906. He was also known in his Hungarian name as Rezső Kastner. He was a Jewish-Hungarian journalist and lawyer. Kastner was one of the leaders of the Budapest Aid and Rescue Committee, otherwise known in Hebrew as the Va'adat Ezrach V'Hatzalah, or Va'ada, which smuggled Jewish refugees into Hungary during World War II, then helped them escape from Hungary when in March 1944, the Nazis invaded that country too, right? It was in February, March 1944 that Adolf Eichmann sets his sights on the Hungarian Jewish community, which at that point was 800,000 strong. Over a period of approximately 8 weeks, 437,000 Jews are deported to Auschwitz. Right? Think of it, it's a staggering number. And ultimately, 2/3, close to 600,000 Hungarian Jews are annihilated in the Holocaust. Between May and July 1944, Hungary's Jews were deported to the gas chambers at the rate of 12,000 people a day. Here's where Kastner comes in. In exchange for money, gold, and diamonds, Kastner negotiated with Adolf Eichmann to allow 1,684 Jews to leave instead for Switzerland on what became known as the Kastner train. Kastner moved to Israel after the war, becoming a spokesman for the Ministry of Trade and Industry in 1952. In 1953, he was accused of having been a Nazi collaborator in a pamphlet self-published by Malkiel Grinwald a freelance writer. We'll be talking more about Grunwald in a moment. The allegation stemmed from his relationship with Eichmann and another SS officer, Kurt Becher, and from his having given positive character references after the war for Becher and two other SS officers, thus allowing Becher to escape prosecution for war crimes. Grunwald also claimed that Kastner had agreed to the rescue in return for remaining silent about the fate of the mass of Hungarian Jews. The Israeli government sued Grunwald for libel on Kastner's behalf, resulting in a trial that lasted 18 months. The court issued its verdict in 1955. So let's turn to the accuser, Malkiel Grunwald. Who was Malkiel Grunwald, who we just read in the brief summary? Malkiel Grunwald was an Israeli hotel owner. He owned a hotel, it's called the Hotel Austria on Kikar Zion in Zion Square in the heart of Jerusalem. He was an amateur journalist and he hailed from Hungary. The devastating background about Malkiel Grunwald is, although he was born in Hungary, in 1937, he came to Vienna and his family was caught in the midst of a pogrom. He was beaten terribly in this pogrom. In 1938, the family emigrated to mandatory Palestine. The 1950s, he began 1950s in his 70s at that point. He began publishing mimeographed pamphlets attacking members of the government. Right? Who was the ruling party in Israel at the time? It was Mapai. It was Ben-Gurion's party. Mapai later on becomes Avodah, or the Labor Party. And essentially, until the rise of Menachem Begin, Avodah, Labor, is the party in power. And essentially, it's a party of Ashkenazic elites. Malkiel Grunwald had a bone to pick against the Mapai party. I want to go to source number 3. That's the source that should be on the screen at this point. In August 1956, he published his 51st pamphlet accusing Kastner of being a Nazi collaborator. Okay, and here's what he writes in that pamphlet. Okay. This is source number 3 that you see on your screen, that you can also see in the PDF. He writes the following: friends, members of Hamizrahi from Hungary. Dear friends, the smell of a corpse scratches my nostrils. This will be a most excellent funeral. Dr. Rudolf Kastner should be eliminated. For 3 years, I have been awaiting this moment to bring to trial and pour the contempt of the law upon this careerist who enjoys Hitler's acts of robbery and murder. On the basis of his criminal tricks and because of his collaboration with the Nazis, I see him as a vicarious murderer of my dear brothers. Okay, so Grunwald prints this in one of his mimeographed pamphlets, and what ends up happening is, as a result of these allegations, Chaim Cohen, who was the Attorney General of Israel and Minister of Justice, turns to Israel Kastner, and says to Kastner that either Kastner sues Grunwald for libel with the support of the Mapai government, right? That he sues him for libel and defamation of character, or Kastner needs to resign from his post in the government. Okay, remember he was Minister of Labor at that point. And of course, right, it's not much of a choice that Kastner has. He's forced into a corner and moves ahead with a libel suit against Grunwald. The complication in all of this is that Grunwald hires an attorney by the name of Shmuel Tamir as his defense attorney. And what we know about Shmuel Tamir is he was a person burning with hostility toward Ben-Gurion and Mapai. And Tamir's defense reflected the common theme of the Holocaust in the 1950s, which is that there was only one of two ways of responding or reacting to the Nazi assault, right? Jews could choose one or the other during the Holocaust. They could either be members of the Judenrat, which meant cooperation and collaboration with the Nazis, right? Or they could be part of the resistance. That was the black and white mindset of Israelis in the 1950s, right? Either, right, you fought actively in the resistance, right? Or you turned against your own people, right? But there was nothing in between. Or third possibility is you were simply a victim here, right? It was a very, very black and white, very, very categorical understanding of what went on in the Holocaust. The trial itself was expected to take about 4 months. It ends up taking almost 2 years total, right? It was a total of 18 months that this trial actively goes on for, about 2 years by the time we come to a verdict. And during those tumultuous years, a debate raged in Israeli society about our understanding of those who survived this nightmare, okay? Natan Alterman, who was one of the poet laureates of Israel, his dates are 1910 to 1970. Alterman was born in Warsaw, Poland. 1925, he comes to Israel at the age of 15, and he becomes the quintessential poetic voice of the Israeli people. And while all of this was tearing apart the fabric of Israeli society, he writes this very, very beautiful and deep work entitled Memorial Day and the Rebels. This is source number 2 in the packet. I want to read through this slowly and carefully. Source number 2, go back. There we are. And on the day of remembrance, the fighters and rebels said, "Do not place us apart from the exile under shining lights at the hour of commemoration. We step down from the pedestal to mingle again in the darkness with the chronicles of the masses of the house of Israel." The fighters and the rebels said, "This is a day of testimony. Its main and true image is not a barricaded stronghold aflame. Neither is it the image of a young man and a girl who came out to assault or die, such as in the classical images of world revolts eternally burning. No, this is not the source of the period. Do not crown it with battle flags. To see only in them its essence, its redemption and justification, the fighters and the rebels said, we are part of many people, part of its honor and bravery and its stifled deep weeping. We are part of a time with no brother, a time that rejects the monotony of high phrases, nor does it stand open-faced among common symbols. Those who fell with their weapons in their hands perhaps will not accept the division between them and the death of their communities, all the way to some leaders and dealers, right? That line that we just read, by the way, is a very, very clear allusion to Rudolf Kastner. Therefore, we, the fighters and the rebels, say, the essence of this day is not just that which is highlighted by speeches and writings by our brothers. The sword, the battle, the barricades, there is nothing to match them. Yet they are not the only symbols of this Memorial Day. Not in them does it reside. The dignity of the nation should not seek its only sublime justification by saying apologetically, I have fought, I have raised the flag of rebellion. The uprising is just one note in this whole story. It is not its heart and goal. Our people will yet compete for honor with any other nation. The fighters and the rebels said, the bravery and the honor of this people are also shared by Jewish fathers who said, the underground will bring disaster upon us. And also, that boy or girl who walked and walked until they were lost somewhere and left behind just one white sock in the archives of remembrance. These two are the symbols of the time and its war. Let us not dim them with the shining sword. Like nations who had not thus been tested by the heavens, thus spoke the fighters and the rebels, and the people listened unmoved. God's stars are witness on the faces of both. How do we understand this poem? What is a message or a couple of messages that you heard as we read Natan Alterman's poem? If you could please raise your hand and unmute yourself. It takes a moment for his words to settle in. Alan.
It feels to me that he is trying to capture what we would today call the fog of war. That it's hard to be for a human to judge these events and the complexities of these events, the nuance of these events, the people that died. Obviously, the end verdict is oblivion to all these folks. Yet it's hard to decide on an absolutist basis who's guilty and who's the hero.
Excellent. Okay, I love what you said in describing the fog of war, right? And what you said at the beginning and what you said at the end, Alan, was perfect. You know, just in terms of, you know, us being able to stand at this point in history and to make judgments on people who are living through that history, right? In many ways is an impossible task, right? Especially when it comes to the victims of that history and how they survived through it. Okay, another volunteer. Linda, I see that you're unmuted.
Yes. To me, it's changing how we look at the victims of the Holocaust, because he said they're to be looked at as the heroes, the fighters, whether they fought or whether they perished.
Excellent. Okay, that is the other critical point of what Alterman is saying, right? He's saying very, very emphatically that we have to move away from this glorification of the one that we perceive as the hero in the war, right? That this is the only one that we put on the pedestal. Right at the beginning, he says this: do not place us apart from the exile under shining lights. At the hour of commemoration, we step down from the pedestal to mingle again in the darkness, right? It's the sense that we are all one. And it's not simply those who fought in the Warsaw Ghetto, right, that are to be memorialized as the heroes of the Shoah, right? The heroes of the Shoah are also those, right, who tragically went to their deaths like sheep going to the slaughter, right? The ones who were the pure victims of this period of history. He also writes very, very beautifully. This reminded me of Schindler's List as I read it, when Alterman writes, are also shared by the Jewish fathers who said the underground will bring disaster upon us, and also that boy or girl who walked and walked until they were lost somewhere, right? It reminds me of that moment in Schindler's List when you see that little girl in the red dress. Everyone knows what I'm talking about, right? If not, you've got to see Schindler's List again. But this is what Alterman is tapping into here, right? And he's saying that, you know, his voice is rising up against this chorus of voices in Israel in 1954 that are rushing to condemn Israel Kastner, right? That are the chorus of voices that were rushing to agree with Grunwald that, right, he was a collaborator, because he sat and negotiated with Eichmann, right? And Alterman is saying, don't be so quick here, right? Remember that it is not black and white. There are many shades of gray here. And Alterman is reminding us that we all have to step down from that pedestal into the darkness, right? This was a very, very prescient warning that he gives to Israeli citizens in 1954. So let's take a look and see the verdict that is ultimately handed down by Justice Halevi on June 22nd, 1955. This is source number 4 that you see at the bottom of the page here. On June 22nd, 1955, Justice Halevi read the verdict. He had acquitted Grunwald of all charges except the one libeling Kastner for getting rich at the cost of his victims. And then these are the different parts of the judgment that he handed down. He said Kastner should have never come in close contact with Nazis as he had done. A Jew, furthermore, a Jewish leader, should have abstained from associating with the murderers. B, he should have never chosen between blood and blood, namely to agree to save just a part of the Jews. C, Kastner should have made public everything he knew about the crimes of the Nazis in real time to allow the Jews to seek ways to save themselves. His active obligation as a Jewish public figure was to initiate an armed rebellion, even if their arms were minimal. And D, Kastner had added to his crimes when, after the war, as a free man, he volunteered to testify in favor of 4 Nazi criminals. This is in the context of the Nuremberg trials. The moment Kastner had turned from a public figure to a traitor was, according to the verdict, the moment he had agreed to organize the famous train in which, by the end, there were 1,684 passengers. The temptation was great. Kastner was given the actual possibility of rescuing, for the time being, 600 souls from the imminent Holocaust, with some chance of somewhat increasing their numbers by payment or further negotiations, not just any 600 souls, but those he considered for any reason most prominent and suitable for rescue. By accepting this present, Kastner had sold his soul to the devil, the exact words of the judge. The success of the rescue agreement depended until the last minute on Nazi goodwill, and the last minute didn't arrive until long after the end of the extermination of the Jews in the provincial towns. What I want you to know about all of this is the way that Kastner conceived of what he was doing is he called it his Noah's Ark. And what's important to pay attention to is that amongst those 1,684 passengers, those Jews that he saved, they were a vivid cross-section of Hungarian Jewry. They were religious, they were non-religious, they were young children, they were the elderly, they were peasants, they were farmers, they were wealthy. Right? The wealthy passengers, right, supposedly each paid $1,000, right, for their passage to Switzerland, right, which, right, was all used as part of a bribe to the Nazi authorities. By the way, those who were on the train tell stories of how terrified they were that they were going to ultimately end up in Auschwitz, right? There were thoughts of these passengers, right? It went through their heads that they should jump off of the train and escape. And in fact, the train ended up at Bergen-Belsen at one point, right? Even though Eichmann had given assurances that the train would be given safe passage to Switzerland, they ended up, right, en route, making a pit stop at Bergen-Belsen. They went through delousing. They actually thought they were going to be gassed at that point, and ultimately got back on the train and were given safe refuge in Switzerland. I'm curious to hear your voices. How would you weigh in on Eichmann? Not on Eichmann, how would you weigh in on what Kastner did? Do you agree with the judge? Disagree? Curious to hear your thoughts. Beatrice and Harold.
I agree with the judge. He sold his soul to the devil. Doing it for money. Especially that he... Oh.
Hi, Matt.
I want to know if you're brave enough to respond after Beatrice's pronouncement.
Right. I think I am.
Agreeing with Justice Halevi here.
Right? You know, it is, when you think about it, it's so difficult. And then you have all these movies where you see people that are made the head of the committee within the Jewish community, and whether it gets to them that, oh my God, here I am now like a God, and who am I going to save and who am I not? That after a while, I think they justify in their mind that they're doing something, that at least they are saving somebody. But what's so amazing is that the Nazis actually kept to the promise and let the people go to Switzerland. I mean, I would never think that they would even have one drop of any kind of empathy. And yet with that happening, I think that he felt as though, now people won't think of him as poorly. But what's so sad is that when it came to a trial, he still was there to be nicer to the Nazi. So he was a very conflicted person. I don't think he was a born vicious person. He, in his mind, was caught at a time that for him, he thought that he was at least doing something good and not
Right.
totally bad.
Look, in many ways, it also reminds me of literally Schindler and Schindler's List.
Mm.
Right? Kastner was compelled to put together a list of these 1,600 people. And certainly there was nepotism, right? His family was saved. And one of the reasons, by the way, that Grunwald goes out against him in a very, very public way is because many of Grunwald's Hungarian Jewish family is annihilated in the Holocaust.
Mm.
Right? So this was in many ways his act of vengeance. Okay, but it was an act of vengeance not only against Kastner, it ended up becoming a political act of vengeance against Mapai and everything that political party stood for. I just want to read you a bit about the passenger list. According to Jenno Kolb, a passenger who kept a diary, there were 972 female passengers and 712 male passengers in all. The oldest was 82, the youngest was but a few days old. Ladislav Loeb, another passenger, writes that the exact number on board when the train left Budapest remains uncertain because in the early stages of the journey, several passengers disembarked, fearing that the train would end up in Auschwitz, while others took their places. Several women threw young children on board at the last minute. What is known is that 1,684 passengers were registered when the train unexpectedly reached the Bergen-Belsen concentration camp near Hanover. According to Loeb, the passengers included 199 Zionists from Transylvania and 230 from Budapest, and 126 Orthodox and ultra-Orthodox Jews, among them 40 rabbis. One of the rabbis was Joel Teitelbaum, the Satmar Rebbe. There were scholars, artists, housewives, peasants, farmers, industrialists, bankers, journalists, teachers, and nurses. So it's tough to make a judgment here. Steve, I see you raising your hand.
Two things. One, I think there may be a precedent for this. Abraham and Sodom and Gomorrah bargaining with God over lives, a similar type of thing. And also we have the saying that it's saving one life is as if he saved the world. And you look at, he saved lives.
Very good, very good. It was a bitter pill for Kastner to swallow, to sit face to face with Adolf Eichmann. But ultimately, I believe you're right, Steve, right? That anyone who's, right, and we know this from the Mishnah, right? This is what you're alluding to, that one who saves a single life, it's as if that person has saved a world entire. So as difficult as it is to accept this reality.
Yeah, that's what I was saying.
And certainly Midat Hadin would have us all agree with Beatrice Jacobson here, right? That in a way he did sell his soul to the devil,
Mhm.
but it was to save lives. Diane.
Yeah. Do you happen to know the actual date of that train? When
Yes,
or
the actual date of the train is, one moment. It was 35 cattle cars that left Budapest on June 30th, 1944.
oh, June 30th. Okay, because when our granddaughter was about to become a bat mitzvah, she went to the Holocaust Center in Los Angeles. I'm going to start crying. And she was able to find out some information about my grandmother's family who came from Transylvania. My grandmother already was in the States. And there were a family that lived in the town of Satmar. And it turned out that was a distant cousin, 13 years old, beautiful little girl who died at Auschwitz on June the 3rd. And, you know, I just wish that she could have been on that
On
special
that Kastner
train
train,
and she
absolutely.
lived. So,
Absolutely.
okay, thank you.
How beautiful, how beautiful. Thank you for sharing that moment with us. Harold?
That, and then
Do
Linda.
do we know what kind of deal he had cut with Eichmann or the Germans? Because, I mean, everybody paid $1,000. It was a tremendous amount of money back then, and even now, if you consider the numbers. Did he keep any money for himself?
It's a very good question, Harold. We don't know if he kept money for himself. That was part of Grunwald's accusation in all of this. It's doubtful that he kept anything for himself. And I truly believe that Kastner's motives were pure here. I believe that he wanted to do anything he could to save whatever number of Hungarian Jewry that he could save at that point. Linda. You have to unmute yourself, Linda.
Sorry. History is a very funny thing. We look at the same moment in history differently depending upon our perspective and the times that we're living in and the history that we bring to it. But trying to put myself in his shoes, he didn't know whether anybody else would be saved. And it certainly does look like he was trying to pick a cross-section that if these were the only survivors,
Right.
they
That's
would
right.
be a cross-section that could build a community from themselves. I mean,
Exactly.
it had to be a horrific choice to have to make. And trying to put myself in his best light, maybe he thought he was trying to do the best by his people.
It was certainly by design, and that's why he called it the Noah's Ark, right? That's why the Kastner train was called the Noah's Ark. Not only that, I want you to, Linda's encouraging us to really put ourselves in his shoes. There's this chilling quote from Eichmann. Kastner was standing face to face with Eichmann, and this is what Eichmann said to Kastner. You seem extremely tense, Kastner. I am sending you to Theresienstadt for recovery, or would you prefer to go to Auschwitz for vacation? Okay, so what I want you to understand is that this was not a conversation of equals here, right? Kastner, as his granddaughter later relates, really felt that, he was standing strong before this Malach HaMavet, this cruel angel of death, as it were. But this was really not a relation of equals. So if we think of it that way and put ourselves in his shoes, it seems to me that the courage of all of this really outshines everything else. And it was a very, very difficult decision on his part to go ahead, but this was a very, very desperate and dark time for our people. I want to push ahead, continue with Chaim Gori. This is number 5. Chaim Gori was an Israeli poet and journalist, and he wrote at the time of the verdict the following. The reading of the verdict lasted for hours. It seemed as if the small room of the Supreme Court was filled again with that period. The years of blood and fear, years of the most sublime heroism, and years of annihilation and loss of human dignity. The scars were torn up anew with merciless cruelty. The judge, with his monotonous, tired voice, described chapter after chapter. His words fell in our ears, harsh and heavy. Countless people had asked themselves a question that will not leave you any peace of mind, a question that seizes the soul. Who is innocent? Who is a traitor? Who is pure? Who is guilty? The judge rose to address this question as well as others, not less cruel. Was the splendor of a wondrous affair, full of heroism and sacrifice, the story of the parachutist tarnished? Many who had watched the judge had asked how a single man accepted the weight of such moral responsibility towards the dead and the living, towards the nation, towards the chronicles of our nation. The man had spoken with shocking clarity. It seems the pure became sevenfold purer. The mission was pure, the parachutists were pure. Pure was their battle against the German annihilation machine, and the image of our immortal murdered sister, Chana Senesh, shone anew with a precious light alongside the killed youth of Peretz Goldstein. Against them stood those who broke down, who erred, and who betrayed, who either knowingly or unknowingly. Those who helplessness, illusion, despair, and a broken heart have turned into collaborators, right? Not a subtle sense of critique here coming from Chaim Gori. In 1957, the most tragic piece of the story, March 1957, Kastner was gunned down by members of the Lehi, right? By right-wing extremists in the aftermath of this judgment. So not only was there this devastating judgment in the courts in Israel, but also, right, a vigilante took justice into his own hands, right, and killed Kastner in Tel Aviv. Also, of course, what's so chilling about that is that Grunwald, when he published his 51st mimeograph, remember his words, he said, Dr. Rudolf Kastner should be eliminated, right? Never underestimate the power of words, right? And so this vigilante group takes justice into their own hands. They kill Kastner, and to the family's credit, the Kastner family comes back and takes his case again to the Israeli courts. And I want to read to you the description of the verdict of Justice Simon Agranat in 1958. Okay, and here's what Simon Agranat writes in the appeal, which ultimately the family wins, and they vindicate Kastner and clear his name. This is what Simon Agranat, what you need to know about Simon Agranat is that he was born in Louisville, Kentucky, and he rose to become president of the Israeli Supreme Court from 1965 to 1976. He served as Chief Justice in Israel. And it was in 1958 that we had the appeal of the Kastner family. And here's what he wrote. The major danger that lurks, according to my opinion, to anyone who attempts to objectively judge the behavior of the dramatis personae who were active in the past, including the near past, emanates from the fact that he cannot always put himself in their shoes. To evaluate the problems they were facing, to understand that life the way they understood it, that is why it is paramount that whoever takes upon himself such a mission, be it historian or a judge, must make maximum effort to set aside his earlier hostile preconceptions and strive for a point of view that is independent of the event he is considering. In other words, his main effort should be to shake off the hindsight he now has so that he is not misled by it to err in his evaluation of the conduct which is the object of his evaluation. I think this was one of the weak spots in the reasoning of Justice Halevi. And then Penina Lahav who wrote this book, which I encourage you all to read, about Simon Agranat. It's entitled Judgment in Jerusalem, Chief Justice Simon Agranat and the Zionist Century. Definitely worth reading. So she writes the following. The heroism of the rebels of the Warsaw Ghetto added a glorious chapter to the history of the Jewish people. It became an inseparable part of our national saga. It will return to influence the national spirit and strengthen among those who need it the sense of national honor. But the position that even in Galut, in the diaspora, and not only in the homeland, Jews should be willing to sacrifice lives for purposes of self-defense and do so without intricate calculations, this position is relevant only to the general Jewish welfare in the long run. It is only within this perspective that one may ask the clearly political question whether Hungarian Jewry should have followed in the footsteps of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. The question before us was much narrower in scope. Agranat expressed the theory tentatively. Earlier in the opinion, he had already asserted, as a matter of fact, that Hungarian Jewry had been terrorized into submission and was not in a position to resist. Perhaps at this stage in his life, Agranat had come to accept the notion that the fervent Zionist goal of becoming a normal people, if translated into the admiration of sheer physical prowess, was itself a sign of abnormality. I repeat that. The admiration of sheer physical prowess is itself a sign of abnormality. The emphasis on honor, physical power, and valiant resistance came at the price of insensitivity to the tragedy of the human condition and the vulnerability of Jews in the face of Nazi terror. Perhaps the best sign of normality was a coming to terms with the past and empathizing with rather than a judging of the millions of victims. Humility, not fiery rhetoric, was needed. Agranat attempted to provide all of these in his long, repetitive, and careful opinion. I understand we have a couple of questions. Let's take a couple of questions that are coming up in the chat.
First in the chat, Toby asks about the $1,000 that the wealthier passengers paid. Was that for the poorer passengers?
Yes, that was also for the poorer passengers, exactly.
Okay,
Right.
and then Larry Dunn adds a comment. His father went to law school with Justice Argonaut at the University of Chicago.
Unbelievable.
Argonaut made Aliyah. He wrote letters to his father encouraging him to also make Aliyah.
Thank you, Larry, for sharing this. Sharing that with
Aliyah.
us. Talk about
And,
Yichus.
Alan has his hand up, and I think,
Linda also has her hand up, and Beatrice.
okay.
Okay.
I would like to add, and maybe this is for a future discussion, but a relevant topic, a current player on the scene, and what I would say is a very much maligned character, is George Soros. Also having a very questionable background, and how that has manifested itself in the destructive performance that he's had on the American scene. I just put that out there as for further discussion. I think
We'll have to have a part 2 on that.
Yes.
Thank you, Alan. Linda, and then Beatrice.
When was the book written, where they look back on the trial, on the appeal, and were looking at things differently again?
Okay, so Penina Lahav writes this book in 1997.
So a good 30, 40, a long
Right, but-
time after.
Well, you're right, but remember that the family's appeal was in 1958, right? So it was
Right.
only a year after
Right.
Passner was killed.
Right,
So-
but I'm saying her book, looking back on this, was written so much later that
Yes,
she's
indeed.
able again
Yeah.
to look at it, as she said,
Right.
more kind of dispassionately, and just look
Exactly.
at it straight ahead and see, like everything else, when public opinion shifts, it can overcorrect, and then it takes a long time to come to a middle ground. And maybe that's what she was perceiving.
Right. And she drives home this message of lo b'chaya, lo b'koach, ele imruchi, right? That it's not by might, not by power, but rather by my spirit, right? That's the driving force here. And we've got to remember that. It's a critique not only of what went on with Kastner, but it's a critique of the Zionist ethos, the classical Zionist ethos, that power should not blind us to our ethical core and ethical being. Beatrice, I'm going to give you the last word before we turn to the delightful punchline of all of this.
After listening everything you read and hearing everybody, it is very difficult to be a judge of why the reasons of a person to do something in a certain moment.
Right. Absolutely, and especially, Beatrice, you know well, given the family history, under the circumstances of the Shoah, I know there are always questions about why didn't German Jews see this coming? Why did they stay, and we can't, we can ask the question, but we can't answer that question because every German Jew, right, had a different reason for, either staying or fleeing, right? And it's not that it was a question of right or wrong in terms of their response, but given, their belief that they were full citizens of Germany, right? And their belief in universalism and the best of humanity, right? It's understandable why they would have held fast to their native land. So, one of the most important takeaways in all of this is the shades of gray that we're reading about here. I want to take you now to completing the circle. And we're going to complete the circle here with Rudolf Kastner's granddaughter, who is a member of Knesset. Today, she sits in the Knesset. Her name is Meirav Michaeli. She is a very, very inspiring member of Knesset. You have a brief bio here. She was born November 24th, 1966. Michaeli is an Israeli Knesset member and a former journalist, TV anchor, radio broadcaster, activist, and I will add, she is my political hero. She was born in Petach Tikva. She's the granddaughter of Rudolf Kastner. She was first elected to the Knesset in 2013 as part of the Labor Party, and she was reelected in 2015, part of the Zionist Union Party. She is now in the Knesset as a member of the Labor Party. And I want to play you two brief clips from her maiden speech in the Knesset, which she gave in 2013. Brett, if you could play those two clips for us. We're going to share the screen in just a moment.
אדוני היושב ראש, כנסת נכבדה, חברותיי חברות וחברי הכנסת. בבוקר יום שני, 3 ביולי 1944, עמד יהודי ציוני בחליפה במשרדו של אדולף אייכמן בבודפסט. עצביך נראים לי רופפים, אמר לו אייכמן. אולי אשלח אותך קצת לנופש באושוויץ? היהודי הציוני שמולו לא התבלבל. הוא שלף מכיסו קופסה והדליק לעצמו סיגריה. שווה בין שווים. האיש הזה היה דוקטור ישראל קסטנר. הוא היה במשרד משום שהוא ניהל עם אדולף אייכמן משא ומתן גם עם קצינים נאצים נוספים, וכך הציל עשרות אלפי יהודיות ויהודים מהשמדה. אחר כך הוא עלה לישראל והיה מועמד לכנסת מטעם מפא"י. רג'ו קסטנר היה סבא שלי. יש לי זכות גדולה להיות חלק מרצף של דורות שמחויבים למפעל הזה שנקרא מדינת ישראל, ולאופן שבו הוא מחזיק את האנשים והאנשים שהיו פזורה, מתוך הבנה שאין לנו מקום אחר מלבד המקום הזה. אבל מתוך המקום הזה גם צומחת הביקורת. המקום שבו מצד אחד אני חלק משושלת מייסדת, אבל מצד שני אני אישה. אמנם אישה פריבילגית, אמנם אישה שהיא הנכדה של, אבל אישה. אישה שהיא עדיין מיעוט בחברה גברית וצבאית, כמו שאפשר לשמוע שוב ושוב כאן בנאומי הבכורה, שבה הערך הגבריות של הצבר היה ערך עליון, לא פחות. המקום הזה הוא המקום שממנו צומחת הביקורת, ואני מגיעה לבית הזה מתוך הרגישות הביקורתית הזאת. אני ממש לא באה בתור קורבן. אם יש משהו שלמדתי מהסיפור של סבא שלי, זה לא להיות קורבן. הוא שאפילו במקום שנכתב עבורו התפקיד האולטימטיבי של הקורבן, יהודי מול משמיד היהודים הראשי, הצליח לא להיות קורבן אלא לקחת את הגורל שלו ושל הקהילה שלו בידיים. ככה אנחנו, הנשים הפמיניסטיות, לא באות כקורבן, אנחנו באות כשוות לכל דבר ועניין. לקחת את גורלנו בידינו ולעצב את מציאות החיים שלנו. אבל לא רק את מציאות החיים שלנו, הנשים. כי אין הרי נשים בנפרד מגברים. אין נשים בנפרד מחברה, מכלכלה, מעבודה, מצבא, ממלחמה, משלום, מביטחון. ולמרות שאתם עושים כל מאמץ, ככל יכולתכם, לא לתת לנו שום דריסת רגל בהחלטה על מלחמות, במשאים ומתנים על שלום, ובהחלטות לגבי מהו ביטחון ואיך משיגים אותו, אין מה לעשות, אנחנו חלק מהדיון. כי אנחנו משלמות את המחיר בעורף כשאתם מחליטים על מלחמה בחזית. אנחנו משלמות את המחיר כשילדים נופלים או נפצעים, כי אין שלום. אנחנו משלמות את המחיר כשאתם משקיעים 1/5 מתקציב המדינה שלנו, בתקציב שאיננו מביא ביטחון.
Okay, now we're going to get to the end of Mirav Michaeli's maiden speech. I encourage you, by the way, to watch this on YouTube. Watch the entire speech. It's incredibly powerful, and I think you, like me, will believe that she be Prime Minister of the State of Israel. Okay, let's continue.
ולא כי אני לא ישראלית. זה מקום שיש בו שלום, לא מלחמה. סבא שלי הציל עשרות אלפי יהודיות ויהודים בשואה, והוא נרצח כאן במדינת ישראל לפני שהוא הספיק להיות חבר כנסת, משום שהוא הציל את היהודיות והיהודים האלה באמצעות מסע ומתן עם הנאצים שרצו להשמיד אותם. הוא עשה את זה בדרך שנראתה לחלק דרך לא נכונה, לא מספיק יהודית, לא מספיק ציונית. אני באה משושלת מייסדת, אבל גם משושלת של לא לגמרי במיינסטרים, לא בקונצנזוס. שושלת של לעשות דברים אחרת. המקום הזה של לרצות לתקן את העולם הוא הרבה פעמים מקום של חולשה. הזדהות עם מצוקה, עם מקום פגיע. לרצות לשמור גם על זכויות של בנות ובני אדם שהם לא כמוני ולא דומות ודומים לי, שהם לא מהצד שלי, עושה אותך הרבה פעמים עוף מוזר. את נחשדת ביפי נפש, את לא אמינה. בישראל הרבה מאוד פעמים כל ביקורת על המדינה או על האופן שבו אנחנו מתקיימות ומתנהלות מתקבלת כלא פחות ממעשה בגידה. אבל האמת היא שזה נעשה מתוך מחויבות למקום הזה, מתוך הזדהות גדולה עם המקום הזה, מתוך רצון לחיות כאן ולעשות את מה שצריך כדי להפוך את המקום הזה למקום הכי טוב עבורנו, הכי נעים, הכי ראוי, הכי מחזק. בשביל זה אני כאן. יותר מזה, היכולת להכיל את האחרות והאחרים, את השוני של מה שסימנו אנחנו בתור האחרות והאחרים מאיתנו, הוא היכולת להכיל את השוני שנמצא בתוך כל אחת ואחד מאיתנו. היא היכולת לחיות עם עצמנו בשלום. רק היכולת להפסיק לדחות ולהדחיק את כל הדברים האלה שאנחנו מחזיקים מהם, לא אנחנו, לא שלנו, רק היכולת לקבל את עצמנו ולאפשר לכל אחד מהחלקים שלנו להיות נוכחות ונוכחים במלואם, במלוא עוצמתם, ולתרום את מלוא התרומה שלהם, תאפשר לנו להיות חברה בריאה ושלמה. חברה משגשגת, חברה עם עוצמה. לשם אנחנו צריכות ללכת. על זה אנחנו צריכות וצריכים לעבוד. בשביל זה אני כאן. תודה.
All I can say as we wrap up is that her grandfather, I believe, would be very proud of her. It's worth listening to that entire speech. To me, the most powerful piece of what she says is that the notion of tikkun olam, of repairing the world, and bikoret, criticism of the state of Israel, comes from a place of wanting this country to be the best that it can be, right? To be the best place possible, living up to the greatest of Jewish values and teachings, right? And to me, right, all else could, sort of fall by the wayside. But I feel that she hits the nail on the head for all of us, that this is the best of what we want. I want to say it's true for both Israel, the United States, wherever it is that you find yourself. There should be a moral and ethical core, and truly you get that sense from Merav Michaeli. So please watch the full maiden speech in its entirety. I hope that over the course of the past hour, we were able to enlighten you on this very, very not well-known trial in Israel, but one that really made its impact on Israeli history. So thank you for being with us. Carolyn, I invite you to officially close for us, and then anyone who would like to stay on and continue the conversation, you're welcome to do so.
Okay, thank you, Rabbi, for that very interesting, powerful, and nuanced teaching. It's hard to talk after that. I really got a little choked up watching that speech. Thank you, everyone, for joining us today. We will stay online for those of you who would like to continue the conversation. I know there were a few hands up. We didn't get to everyone. I want to let you know we posted in the chat the link to the full YouTube of that trial. We've also posted a link to the next teaching from community engagement, which happens on Monday afternoons. You're all welcome to join us. It's a program of faculty presentations to the community. The next date of this class is August 20th. We'll send you out a reminder ahead of time. Again, this is a product of JTS Kolot, and we appreciate you all being here. If you have any questions, feel free to send a message to whoever sent you the invitation for this, or send us a note in the chat. With that, if anyone has questions, I'm happy to call on you now.